Welcome to the Yemen Brief Podcast, the place to turn for informed insight about what's happening in Yemen. This podcast is brought to you by the team at the Center for Strategic Studies. I'm AbuBakr al-Shamahi, a researcher at the Center, and your host for today's episode of our ongoing series with experts and interesting individuals from the country and around the world. The Saudi-led coalition's partial blockade of Houthi-controlled territory in Yemen has been heavily criticized by Yemenis and the international community alike. The policy has seen the entry of certain products into Houthi-controlled ports, such as Hodeidah, be prohibited, while the importation of oil and food is limited thanks to an inspection process and is periodically stopped at the whim of the Yemeni government and the coalition. But is a total and immediate lifting of the blockade the correct answer? The Yemeni government and the Saudi-led coalition argue that it's necessary to prevent the Houthis from receiving external support, most notably from Iran. And some observers think that while the blockade should be lifted would be to make that part of a wider peace process. Our guest today to discuss the topic is Thomas Juneau, an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Juneau is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies. His analysis piece, "The Saudi Blockade of Yemen Must Be Lifted, but Not in Isolation," can be found on our website, sanacenter.org. Thank you for joining us today, Thomas. Now, the title of your analysis rather reveals your position, perhaps. I remember when you wrote the article, there was a backlash from some, especially within some Western activist circles, and you're navigating sort of a narrow space with the piece, where you say on one side that the blockade is morally repugnant, but that simply lifting it wouldn't be the answer. Can you explain your position and how you came to it?
That's a very good question. And I think you framed it well when you said that it's a bit of a narrow space, because it is. And it's a narrow space, but it's also a somewhat nuanced space. And that's where in a lot of the debates, especially on social media, especially on Twitter, where, as everybody knows, polarization is very intense, especially on issues like this, that nuance was lost. So when I made the case, first on Twitter, and then in that article that you referred to for the Sana Center, people on either side of the debate lost track in many cases of the middle ground that I was taking and assumed that I was on the other side as opposed to the middle. So what I'm saying is, yes, the blockade is wrong. It is wrong on moral grounds because a lot of Yemeni civilians are victims of the blockade, innocent victims. And it is also wrong in many ways from a strategic level, in the sense that Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen has been a disaster, not only morally, but also strategically. It's a quagmire. It is not achieving the objectives that it wants to achieve. Does that mean that the blockade should be lifted, that the US should pressure Saudi Arabia to stop it now? Well, no, that's where I don't think that there's a direct logical next step. Why? Because if the blockade is lifted, what happens? The Houthis benefit, and the Houthis directly benefit, and arguably no one else does. I don't think Yemeni civilians would significantly benefit, at least not in the longer term, because precedent, and we can talk about this in more detail in next questions, but the precedent clearly shows that if the blockade is lifted, the Houthis will use the extra space that they gain to fuel their war effort and not to improve the humanitarian situation in the country. So lifting the blockade, for a lot of these activists in left-wing circles in the US and Europe and Canada too, when they make that call, they come from, in some cases, a good place in the sense that they make a moral case for lifting the blockade. What I think to be blunt, they don't understand is that the outcome they would achieve would not be what they intend.
I mean, to kind of dive a bit deeper into that argument, do you think that the international community, the Saudi-led coalition, do they have any other means to pressure the Houthis and get them to the negotiating table? Because that's been the problem, hasn't it?
That's a very good question. And that's where my argument is not perfect. And I readily admit that. Because right now, one of the major challenges for Saudi Arabia, but also for the US, for the international community, for the European Union, it is very difficult right now for the international community to try to pressure the Houthis. Why? Because the Houthis are winning the war. They have not won, but they are winning in the sense that they are increasingly dominant in Yemen. But B, the Houthis are very much a local actor inside Yemen. They don't have bank accounts abroad. They don't have extensive interests abroad like other targets of American sanctions in the world, think China, Russia, Iran, etc., have. So the ability of the US to pressure the Houthis to try to push them towards a peace process, as is an integral part of the argument I explained in answer to your previous question. There's a weakness here in my argument, because as much as I'm saying don't lift the blockade, try to push the Houthis into more comprehensive peace negotiations, that's very hard to do because the US has very limited tools at its disposal to do that. So one counter argument to my analysis would be to say, well, that's one of the only ways to pressure the Houthis that the US has, which is not an argument completely disconnected from reality or devoid of truth. But I still don't think it's optimal. The US has very limited leverage with the Houthis, but using patient diplomacy, using pressure on the Houthis, trying to bring Iran on board, bring the UN on board, Saudi Arabia, other regional players, to try to steer all of the actors in Yemen towards a peace process. Is it easy? No, it's not. At this point, there is no obvious solution to make it happen quickly. But lifting the blockade, or pressuring Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade, to be more accurate, is appealing in theory, but in practice, really, I don't think that it would make things better.
It's interesting that you presented the counter argument, perhaps to your own argument there. I think the point that we can go back to actually when it comes to peace negotiations is actually, and how difficult these peace negotiations can be in terms of the outcome of what happens from them, is the last real big peace negotiations that were surrounding the coalition and the government attack on Hodeidah at the time in 2018. Now, the Stockholm Agreement emerged as a result of that, which put a stop to that attack, and there was some sort of agreement there that both sides were supposed to abide by. Now, if we examine the fallout from the Stockholm Agreement, we've seen the Houthis go on the attack since late 2018, and really be in the ascendancy, especially now when we look at the situation in Marib. Is it likely now, because of this past experience in Hodeidah and with the Stockholm Agreement, be unlikely and unwilling to make the concessions that are necessary for humanitarian reasons?
Bringing the Stockholm precedent, as you just did, is a very good idea, because I think it illustrates what I mean. Just to put briefly into context, 2018, the Houthis, the internationally recognized government, meet in Sweden, thus the name of the Stockholm Agreement, with a significant number of members of the international community, the EU in particular, the US, the UN are there, and an agreement is brokered to try to calm things down on the western coast of Yemen. It calls for some withdrawal of forces, for some confidence building measures, for some kind of observation force. Most of that doesn't happen. There are some tentative early steps are taken right after the agreement, but by now, really not much has happened. When we look back, what actually happened as a result of the Stockholm Agreement is that it allowed the Houthis to redeploy a lot of their forces because of the calming down of the situation on the West Coast. So the Houthis basically used the Stockholm Agreement to strengthen their positions elsewhere in the country. So that precedent is extremely relevant, because there's actually no doubt in my mind, and that's a point that I make in the article you referred to, that if there was a lifting of the blockade, partial, complete, whatever format, the Houthis would absolutely use that as a cover, strengthen themselves on other fronts. So if a hypothetical lifting of the blockade leads to more fuel imports, a lot of those fuel imports, probably the majority, would support the Houthi war effort. If more food comes in, the Houthis would tax it heavily and divert a lot of it, and that would again benefit their war effort. So the Stockholm Agreement is very useful in that sense. We should not frame the Stockholm Agreement as what it was intended to be, i.e. some kind of a confidence-building measure towards a peace process, but rather as a tool for the Houthis to strengthen their position. So will that make Saudi Arabia more reluctant in the future to engage in such confidence-building measures, Saudi Arabia and the international community? It absolutely should. And it does make future efforts at reaching peace much more complicated. That's unfortunate, but that's the reality. And that's why in thinking about future initiatives, efforts, whether UN-led or pushed by the US or directly between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, we absolutely have to keep in mind who the Houthis are and what are their objectives and what kind of exploitation of any peace agreement we should expect on their side.
So if we're to think of this wider peace process that removing this blockade or lifting the blockade would be part of, what are the other parts of this peace process, these negotiations, this deal? What are you thinking? What would perhaps bring about the solution that Yemen really needs to come out of this war?
Well, the easy answer to your question is that I don't know, and by saying I don't know, I'm being honest in the sense that I having looked at this war for a long time now, mostly from a perspective of the involvement of regional and external powers, I very unfortunately do not see any reason for optimism in terms of peace prospects in Yemen. It would be very easy to come up with theoretical constructs that would to try to frame any future peace process. In the short to midterm, I don't think any of those are likely to work, largely for two reasons. A, the Houthis are winning and they are not in a mood to compromise. And as long as the dominant actor in any civil war is not in a mood to compromise, prospects for peace are extremely low. That's true in Yemen right now, and it's true in other civil war contexts. But B, I've talked a lot about the Houthis so far, and I think they deserve the criticism that I've addressed to them. But at the same time, the other side of the equation is the internationally recognized government, which is weak, fragmented, corrupt, unreliable, led by a president, Hadi, who is equally, as his coalition is, weak and corrupt and just not very competent. That's also a major obstacle to peace. Because from a balance of power perspective, as long as the internationally recognized government is so weak relative to the Houthis will be dominant and will want to continue advancing. And it just makes the whole effort to deal with the Houthis much more difficult. So, your question was how to make peace progress. One of the answers to that is a new president. And I absolutely realize how easy it is to say that from, my house in Ottawa and in practice, how difficult it is to do that. But Hadi is a major obstacle to peace. And so is the weakness of the government that he leads. Another element that I think is a major obstacle to peace is the United Nations framework. A new UN envoy comes in with a lot of dynamism, hopefully some new ideas. But that UN envoy is handicapped, has his hands tied by the framework he has to operate in, which is UN Security Council Resolution 2216. That resolution came about at the beginning of the war and reflects realities at that time. It is a resolution that entrenches Saudi Arabia's maximalist demands, which are simply disconnected from the reality on the ground, which is the Houthis are winning. So 2216 basically locks participants in a framework that is many years outdated. Again, very easy to say, hard to do. The conditions for a new Security Council resolution today, as we speak, are not there. But at some point, there will have to be one because the current one simply makes the structure of a UN-led peace process extremely unappealing for the Houthis.
It was great to really dig into those thoughts and ideas and discuss them. So thank you so much for taking the time out today to join us, Thomas. And thank you to the audience for listening. This podcast is part of a Sana'a Center program examining the roles of state and non-state foreign actors in Yemen. You can find us online at sana'acenter.org or on Facebook or Twitter.